I think we'll get started. So welcome everyone to this Research Notes seminar hosted by the Resources, Environment and Development Group at Crawford, and welcome to those joining online as well. So I'd like to begin the seminar by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, that the land's unceded, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So my name is Simon West. I'm a lecturer with the Resources, Environment and Development Group at the Crawford School. And we're very honoured today to have with us Professor Dr. Rahul Mukherji from the Heidelberg University in Germany, who will present to us today on embedded liberalism, globalization, and India's emergence in climate change regimes. So Professor Mukherji is the head of Department of Political Science at the South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University, and his research interests include democratic recession, welfare, and environmental politics, and India's foreign economic policies and globalization. So prior to Heidelberg, Professor Mukherji taught at various universities, including the National University of Singapore, the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India, and the University of Vermont in the United States. And I think he's also had some connections to ANU in the past as well. So a nice history there. So Professor Mukherji edits the journal Indian Politics and Policy and co-edits the Oxford Institutions and Development in South Asia Book Studies also. His books include Globalization and Deregulation, Ideas, Interests and Institutional Change in India, published with Oxford University Press in 2014. So we're very pleased to have you with us today, Rahul. So the structure of the session is that Rahul will talk for about half an hour or so, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion for the last 20 minutes. Couple of small housekeeping items. So we're recording the seminar, the talk, but we will not be recording the question and answer. And if Rahul agrees, then we'll make the presentation available on the Crawford YouTube channel afterwards. And just a reminder to Zoom participants, if you could please keep your microphones on mute during the seminar. So with that, I'll hand over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Simon, for that very generous introduction. In a passing sort of way, he did mention that I have had an association with the Australian National University, which is very evident because you can see three dons sitting by your side. And I'm, of course, very, very delighted to be invited by the Crawford School, because when I came here, there wasn't a Crawford School. But I'm even more delighted that my old friends found the time to do this presentation. And I'm sure there will be Q&A where I will also have matters to learn. I was a visiting fellow at the Australia South Asia Research Centre in what was then called the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies in 2002. And Professor Jha, who is in the audience, was my host. And then the other two, Professors Hill and Professors Atu Korala, equally became compatriots and friends in my struggle to succeed in academic life. So it's always good to keep one's presentation within 30 minutes, because otherwise it does get boring. So I will do three things, I think. The first is I will talk a little conceptually about embedded liberalism. And then I will argue conceptually about India's path. And I will marry the embedded liberalism idea with India's path. And then I leave it to you, for you to judge whether the trajectory of trade and what we saw in the case of vaccine diplomacy, leading on to what we find in the case of climate finance, actually resemble a backslide or a continuation of the embedded liberal path. So that is sort of the structure of my presentation. And briefly, this really doesn't need to be stated in any great detail. North-South relations have been understood traditionally in a very profound way within the Marxist school of thinking, which started in a very significant way with Lenin and then with people like Wallerstein and others who talked about neocolonialism and neo-imperialism. And the whole idea was that there are two types of economic structure that are in conflict. A more nuanced view of this structural conflict came about in the work of Stephen Krasner, who published a book in 1988 called Structural Conflict, where he kind of deviated a little bit from the Marxist line into what scholars of international relations call realist international relations. And he argued that the North and the South are in conflict, in irresolute conflict, but not the same kind as imperialism would suggest. Because countries in the South have weak states, which cannot extract resources enough for them to be able to compete in the global economy. They have traditional societies where ascriptive criteria is very important. Socially, they will not be able to adjust. And for all of these reasons, they will never become market competitive. And using the dependency theory and the value of sovereign equality, they will continue to successfully beat the hell out of the Northern commitment to the market. So the Northern commitment to the market is inexorably conflicted with the Southern commitment to redistributive transfers. And that is your structural conflict. Of course, we know that the world has changed since 1988. And today, many of the countries in the peripheral parts of the global economy are threatening the core countries of the world. Then, from the perspective of the developed countries, a very powerful way of thinking was hegemonic stability, which argued that if you have an economic system with a preponderant power, in many ways, you solve the Olsonian problem of collective action. And what you do there is that one significant power has the resources and the will to provide collective goods, to promote trade. And it doesn't worry about relative gains because it's just the preponderance that matters, and you need those collective goods even for your own benefit. So there are a lot of very nuanced arguments about hegemonic stability, how the Dutch were hegemons, how the British were hegemons, and how the Americans were hegemons or are hegemons. But we now know that hegemonic stability is threatened by emerging powers. But even before that happened, John Ruggie at Columbia University made a very powerful argument, saying that hegemonic stability doesn't tell you everything. Because hegemons produce collective goods, but what kinds of collective goods are these? And these collective goods are decided on the basis of certain ideas that produce logics of appropriateness. And he drew the attention of the world to the discussions between John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White of the United States to argue that the American Pax Americana was substantially different from British Pax Britannica, where adjustments had to be more automatic. Here, learning the lessons of the Great Depression, social and domestic imperatives were given a much greater say in the embedded liberal order produced by Bretton Woods institutions, where counter-cyclical funding and things of the sort were kind of pledged. So in some ways, embedded liberalism seeks to embed the liberalism within a domestic social context and pays much greater attention to democracy and social concerns. John Ruggie passed away a few years ago, great scholar. He was teaching at Columbia when I was a student, and he ruled the fact that neoliberalism had actually moved away from that embedded liberal ideal. Now, I will argue that paradoxically enough, the Indian path is a kind of follows more the embedded liberal model than the automatic adjustments model, where domestic social considerations are very important. And some of the work that produces evidence in that regard is my work on how India's globalization actually happened. And in that vein, I have argued that perhaps you have to understand India from the perspective of a policy paradigms and layered tipping displacement model, where layered changes in policies and laws, when they reach a threshold, tip in a certain direction. Why do these layered changes happen? These layered changes happen because scientific knowledge produces a critical understanding of previous policy paradigm, but policy paradigms following, Thomas Kuhn or Imre Lakatos are not exactly perfectly scientific. They have irrational ways of surviving. So even when you know that the public sector is not doing everything that it should be doing, or when autarkic industrialization is not producing all the results it should be, you still persist with those results. But then when change happens, it doesn't happen because of policy diffusion through the IMF. Because one of the critiques of my work would be that, India globalized in July of 1991 when there was a balance of payments crisis. But I have argued in my book, and there are two serious chapters with archival materials, and I got the Bell Mission report declassified for public view because those were the conditions that the World Bank had for the 66 devaluation that India did. That India pretty much did what it wanted both in 91 and in 1966. In 1966, the dominant paradigm was import substitution. And from 67 onwards, Mrs. Gandhi became more inward-looking than Jawaharlal Nehru. In 1991, I have brought evidence to bear saying that it is not the business class, it is not necessarily the multilaterals, but it is a very finely developed view within the Indian technocratic, which of course interacted and made use of the multilaterals to beat vested interests especially within the business class, to promote a kind of globalization that became possible because the system tipped. I know that many of the things that I'm saying will not sound convincing to you, and I'm willing to take it on during Q&A, but not to belabor the point beyond the fact that I'm arguing for a largely endogenous model of change. I'm also arguing for a tipping point model of change. And if you want to see the more refined version in a sort of systematic, the journal is mentioned, but a more sort of broad-based, well sort of covered view is in the book. But the journal is a more recent publication. So in terms of my conceptual evolution, you have more in the journal than in the book. Now, let's look at what's happening to trade to GDP today as a result of what happened in 91 and what are the trajectories after the current government came to power in 2014. What's happening? It's opening up. So you will actually find, if you get to this slide, that India's trade to GDP was actually growing pretty rapidly until 2010. And after the global financial crisis, there have been issues. And despite the sort of what might one call Mr. Modi's neoliberal approach, the trade to GDP ratio actually has not increased significantly. Then let's go to the next slide because we don't want to waste time.
Trade is merchandise trade.
Merchandise.
Not service.
Not service. This is World Bank trade. Trade as a percentage of GDP until 20. This is just the World Bank data.
Yeah.
And you will find a similar outcome if you look at foreign investment as a percentage of GDP. Again, there is this view that the government wants to promote foreign investment and all of that, which leads us to believe that there are possible reasons for us to think that there is a creeping in mercantilism, which is probably, I'm not saying this with a lot of, because I haven't done the most serious research on this, but I will tell you why I feel that there is creeping mercantilism. Can we then move on to the next slide? Let us just forget this because they are in the slides and you can certainly access them. So we go to slide number, this one. I'll just come down to this one, the sixth one. Yeah. Yeah. So in relation to our globalization, I sort of argued in a comment piece in International Studies Review that if John Ruggie talked about embedded liberalism for the United States, it's very relevant for India as well. That it's not sort of the laissez-faire type of liberalism. It's an embedded liberal. And in another chapter in an edited volume, I sort of reviewed briefly sort of a large number of FTAs that India had signed up to 2016, which is pretty much the update till today because India hasn't signed an FTA after 2011. And I argued, especially with much greater and deeper knowledge regarding the Indo-Lanka Free Trade Agreement, that it was a very embedded liberal way in which India approached the free trade agreement. In this particular case, India for the first time actually showed at the time of the negotiations much greater consideration for Sri Lanka than it normally does for other countries. And I can tell you why. We don't want to waste our time doing that. Of course, there was enough consideration for Indian vested interests as well. One can make similar arguments about the Indo-ASEAN FTA, on which I have not done the research, but on the Indo-Lanka FTA, I actually was in Colombo for a month, and I published a separate paper in that regard. All of this research shows that you can't do a laissez-faire kind of adjustment within India's political economy, and therefore the embedded liberal idea is kind of. Now, coming to a recent paper that was published in the Review of International Political Economy, there is this puzzle about free trade agreements. And in this puzzle about free trade agreements, what is being argued is that as you can see in the slide, you don't have free trade agreements with India after 2011. So India does a lot of free trade agreements till 2011, but not anything after 2011. And after 2011, as you can see, China has run more free trade agreements, not India. So Serrano and Eckhart produce a couple of reasons for this. Reason number one they produce in this article is that India is much more service-based. And therefore, free trade agreements don't work so well for India because it's not a manufacturing leader. Reason number two is that India just has more veto players than China. This is an India-China comparison. And reason number three is that there is more experiential learning over free trade agreements that has produced free trade skepticism in India. Very fine paper, very well researched. But problems with research like this is that you don't treat policy paradigms or ideas as a variable. Because when you go into the way they describe sort of why India has learned experientially that free trade doesn't work, when you go into their material on why the Niti Aayog has become so much more skeptical about RCEP, you have to distinguish the fact that when India was getting into free trade agreements, when India went into 1991, of course, they were embedded liberal, but there was a huge ideational commitment to liberalism. And I can talk a lot about that because my work dealt with policymakers and what they were doing. And I looked at the letters that were exchanged between the World Bank, the IMF, and so in a way, research such as this is sort of static India-China. It can point to, if you have the ideational lens to look at this kind of result, that what kinds and why is the Niti Aayog talking very differently from the old Planning Commission or from the old Foreign Affairs Ministry, which had a huge say in producing free trade agreements. The Prime Minister's office itself would play a very, very important role in making these things happen. And in this particular context, it strikes me that what is being touted as science is also a matter of faith, that we enter into RCEP, and then the Chinese will flood us with goods and services. And we cannot have enough measures to protect the economy. I had a conversation with Mr. Shyam Saran, who's certainly not a free trader. He was the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on climate change. He was also the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on the nuclear deal. One of the finest diplomats and very non-partisan. I mean, he could criticize. And even he came to the view that India should have signed the RCEP. So all of these things point me in the direction that India's willingness to go liberal, even though in an embedded liberal way, is somewhat moving in a different direction. On vaccines, I just want to talk about not so much about India's desire to embed itself liberally, but the kind of policy competence that is guiding the present government. And we've done some work on COVID and democracy. We published some papers. But this stuff is not published. This stuff is kind of... So I found that Gavi, which was the alliance leading vaccines, which had Bill and Melinda Gates, and there is a whole architecture of the alliance, was clear that the Serum Institute of India could provide vaccines not only for India, but for the rest of the developing world. In fact, Cyrus Poonawalla was given a Vaccine Hero Award. There's an enormous amount of strength in India's pharmaceutical industry. What did the government do? The government, before the second wave, pre-ordered just 350 million sort of shots in a country which has so many more people. The result of that was, and then of course it exported about 60 million vials. When the second wave came, both the two companies, Bharat Biotech and the Serum Institute, were not even able to meet their domestic requirements. And they were being pushed to meet domestic requirements in a way that they were unable to meet easily. Why? Because even Donald Trump puts in a lot of money behind vaccines, but Mr. Modi did not. And then he bifurcated the investment into the Serum Institute as well as a domestic producer, Bharat Biotech, resulting in a catastrophic situation where states actually had to go to Pfizer, BioNTech, and many other, Moderna and others, and were purchasing vaccines at a very, very high price. Now, what is the technocratic context? The technocratic context is that the Indian Council of Medical Research had a survey done, which was almost like a nuclear secret. I mean, to find out about that survey, I had to talk in Signal with one of the scientists at the ICMR. The technocrats knew that this was a problem. Then there was an organization called INSACOG, which was headed by a man called Shahid Jamil, who went public saying that we are expecting the second wave to happen. That report was shared with the cabinet secretary. It is hard to believe that something that the cabinet secretary has would not be communicated to the prime minister, but no action was taken. So in a way, India was caught by surprise in a situation where if it had actually funded its industrial capacity much better, it would have not only vaccinated the country much better, it would have even vaccinated the developing world, which was Gavi's view. I mean, I think the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had already earmarked 300 million US to the Serum Institute. So here we find, and moreover, there are other critics who argued that this could also have been made possible through compulsory licensing. So neither did the state go in the direction of compulsory licensing to see that there are many other vaccine manufacturers, even in the public sector, who can produce cheap vaccines. So this is not a very highly talked about issue, but it is an issue that I did some research on, and I found that India could very well have dealt with this problem domestically and used its pharmaceutical prowess to attempt vaccinating the developing world. Now, with regard to environmental negotiations, what I want to say is that India was largely in the structural conflict mode until about 2005 or so. Indian policymakers were saying most of the time that colonialism has been rapacious and the world has been despoiled by the developed world, and therefore redistributive transfers have to be made, just like Dresden. That logic changed. I mean, this is true of the ozone layer negotiations, which I can take in the Q&A. That logic actually really changed in 2007, when Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh came up with a brilliant idea, which was that India will respect the per capita emissions of the developed world. Now, why do I say this is a brilliant idea? Because it fits the embedded liberal model very well. Per capita emissions gives you a lot of time, but per capita emissions also says that you are committed. And you're no longer saying that the West has to actually bail you out of this situation. All of this is happening in the context of an India which is emerging, whose emergence has to be taken seriously, and in the context of a meeting of the Brazil, South Asia, India, China group, the basic group in 2008. Now, in order to prepare for the basic group, which met in Tokyo in 2008, India launched in 2008, by the month of August, I think, the National Action Plan on Climate Change. I want to say a few words about the National Action Plan, because the National Action Plan is really the most comprehensive document on what India has pledged for climate change. 109% budgetary increase. But what is the political economy of the National Action Plan? The political economy of the National Action Plan was that Ambassador Shyam Saran, who negotiated the successful nuclear deal, was made the special envoy on climate change. The special envoy had enormous coordinating powers with an unusual authority that the Prime Minister backed him up with. People think that Manmohan Singh was a weak Prime Minister, but he did a couple of things in his first tenure, which were actually quite unusual. The nuclear deal, and the second one, which is not talked about to the same extent, is the National Action Plan. We have a revise and resubmit with policy studies. So the meeting happened, the first meeting happened on the 13th of July, where the Prime Minister's scientific advisor, the Tata Energy Research Institute director, and the Secretary of the Ministry of Finance met and produced a report on the 26th, by the 26th of November 2007, when the second meeting happened. And in all of the meetings, the Prime Minister was present himself. The Prime Minister argued that, you've given us a very good technical report, but this doesn't mean anything. It must be intelligible to the lay audience. It must make very clear to the world what India's commitments are and what India expects from the world. The third meeting happened on the 2nd of June 2008, when the Prime Minister urged once again that you have to simplify this report. You have to make, we have this material from an RTI document, which actually gives us what happened inside the negotiations. So that the plan was out on the 30th of June, and the Tokyo summit happened in July 2008. What was interesting about this plan was its embedded liberal nature. There were commitments to climate mitigation, but people understood that mitigation would take a long time to arrive and it'd be very expensive. So they decided that they will certify energy efficiency in a variety of amenities. And that became very popular. So you buy something for a higher price, which is more energy efficient. So in these ways, convenient strategies were evolved and a fair amount of commitment happened. Most recently, in the Glasgow summit, COP26, Prime Minister Modi said that India will have net zero emissions by 2070. Now, this is actually a very bold statement. In this particular area, I feel that India is trying to move in an embedded liberal direction much more than in the area of trade. But the question is, how much of this move is technically feasible, has a lot of different views, and I haven't done the primary research here. So according to an LSE report, this transition will take will require 10 trillion US. No clear roadmap about how these resources will be generated in order to meet this goal. Carnegie India has a report which again says that more needs to be done. It's good that Reliance, Adani, and Tata are investing in electric vehicles, but there is much greater need to de-risk these investments. India needs to coordinate much better with multilaterals, and India needs to blend its financial institutions in a much greater way with things like green city bonds. And finally, India needs to spend much more on climate tech startups, according to Carnegie. India sort of invested 1 billion between 2016 and 21. Same figure for Europe was 15 billion, China 20, and the United States 50. Now, if you look at another climate policy initiative report, which is of Indian vintage, you have an understanding that the country needs to spend something like 2.5 trillion between 2015 and 2030, which means 170 billion per year to achieve the nationally determined contributions. In 2019-20, it spent about 44. Flows have increased substantially, no question about that. From my perspective, what all of this shows is that you cannot argue that India is not committed to climate change anymore. I think this is an area where financial commitments are serious. They continue to be embedded liberal, but they are probably short of what pledges have been made. So that was what I wanted to present, and I think I'm already 2 minutes over time. So I leave you to judge what is happening to embedded liberalism in trade, vaccines, and climate. And I'm happy to clear my own confusions with you.